Okay, great. It looks like I've got that it's about noon. Um, so welcome everyone to the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative and the University of Minnesota Extension's Forestry webinar series. We're really happy today to have a presentation on deer and the new Minnesota DNR deer management plan. Before we get to that and we turn it over to Eric, I wanted to introduce kind of the WebEx system that we use. You should all be hearing my audio coming through right now, in addition to seeing the slides of Eric's with the Minnesota DNR logo. So that should be in front of you. We also encourage you to ask questions to the speaker. And to do that, we encourage you to use either the chat area or the Q&A area, and both should be found in the lower right side as you're looking at the WebEx system. And so as you have questions or as you have comments, feel free to type those in, and then we'll relay those to Eric as we go through the presentation today. Um, and other things to note of, we're going to stop about halfway through to kind of relay any questions to Eric, and then again toward the end of the presentation. And so this month we're focusing on deer. I did want to mention next month's webinar. Many of you know we do these monthly webinars, and next month's webinar is focused on forest inventory with LiDAR, Minnesota's approach. And the next webinar next month is on Tuesday, November 20th, and you can join us for that. So with that, to today's task, to talking about deer. And the Minnesota DNR, I know has been putting in a lot of effort recently in updating their deer management plan and communicating that plan with citizens of Minnesota. And so I want to introduce Erik Thorson. Erik is the acting big game program leader with the Minnesota DNR. And he's going to step us through kind of outlining the deer management plan and talking about this statewide effort that the DNR has been involved with over the past, looks like several years now. So Erik, I'll turn it over to you and you can unmute your system and take it away.
All right, thank you, Matt. Can you hear me all right?
Sure can, Erik.
All right, very good. Well, thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. It's very nice to have an opportunity to talk about our new statewide deer management plan that is kind of hot off the presses, and we're just starting to implement across the state. Maybe a little bit about my background. Went to the University of Minnesota, got a bachelor's of science degree in fish and wildlife at the University of Minnesota, and stayed there for my master's degree as well in wildlife conservation. And I started with Minnesota DNR as a private lands biologist in the South Metro about 18 years ago. Since then, I've had a variety of positions with DNR, mostly working with forest management for forest wildlife planning, and also in the area wildlife role here as an assistant area wildlife manager and area wildlife supervisor here in the Park Rapids area in north central Minnesota. And this is my second stint as a big game program leader, kind of on a mobility acting role. So the last time I did this was in 2012, and I've been doing it for about the past year here, and plan to be in this position until about mid-November, so about another month here. So been involved in this statewide planning effort, and was kind of update you on our progress to date and how we got to where we are. So I guess with no further ado, just continue with the presentation here, and as Matt mentioned, will be time for questions and about halfway through and at the end. So see if I can advance the slide here. So just an overview for today. So kind of take a step back and just provide a little bit of history on how we've managed deer in Minnesota in the past, and kind of how we got to where we are now with developing a statewide deer plan, and some of the background and that led to this planning process that we were involved with, and led to the plan development. So we'll talk about the process that we used. And there's a lot of information in our statewide deer plan. You know, some things would be of more interest to you than others. So I'll try to focus on the goals that I think will be most interesting to folks in the forested regions of Minnesota. Kind of touch on some other topics you're likely be interested in, or that could likely be addressed as we implement the plan. And also just talk about the first implementation steps that we're taking here this summer, since the plan has been finalized, and kind of what our plans are for the next 2-3 years as we move forward with this plan. And it is a 10-year plan. And then also, I know a number of folks have talked to DNR wildlife managers in the past and are familiar with deer management, but I just want to kind of give you idea how you can become involved in deer management in Minnesota. You know, the plan has been finalized now, and we took a lot of input and incorporated the input into the plan, but there's still opportunities to be involved and kind of set the direction for the future for deer management and the resources that deer affect across the state. So just kind of a step back and how we've managed deer in the past, and it's always been by deer permit areas or individual deer permit areas across the state. So we currently have 130 different deer permit areas, and they're kind of county-sized areas or smaller in many cases. And those boundaries have changed over time depending on maybe ecological or habitat reasons or ownership. So we're trying to identify the best units for deer management based on the resources that are there and the populations that are there. So those boundaries have changed over time, but it's been a consistent management unit that we've used here in Minnesota for a number of years. And then back in the mid 2000s, when we had very high deer populations, there was a real interest in using a public process to identify what the population goal should be for those individual deer permit areas across the state. And so we kind of started with a goal setting process that lasted 3 years and then covered the entire state. So we kind of blocked it up, and you can see the different colors of the permit area blocks here across the state, and they were loosely based on ecological subsections across the state. So trying to group by similar habitat types or ecological classifications throughout Minnesota. And then we had stakeholder teams that were formed for each one of those blocks or of permit areas across the state, and they provided recommendations on where they thought the deer populations should go from their current relative level. And then we took public comment on what those relative change goals or recommendations were. So for instance, in permit area 184 in the Bemidji area, they might say, you know, we think the population is currently too high and we would like to see a population decreased by 25% over the next 3 to 5 years. And so that's the type of goal recommendation that we went to the public with, received comments on that. Oftentimes we hear mostly from deer hunters when we ask about deer population levels, because they are folks that are the most keyed in on deer population levels, but also we hear from agricultural interests and forest management interests as well, and other folks that have a stake in deer. And so got public comment through that process, and most of it was online. We are just trying to get as much input as we could, and have struggled in the past with in-person public meetings, you know, having low participation. So we kind of developed a new online way of commenting, and this was relatively new back in the mid 2000s, and worked fairly well to kind of reach out and hear from a number of folks, and then ultimately compiled that public comment and check to see what kind of folks are thinking about the team recommendations, and then brought a recommendation forward to the DNR commissioner for his ultimate approval of those goals. And so we've been operating with those goals for quite some time. You know, one challenging thing with those goals that were set in the mid 2000s is that we were at historically high deer populations, and so across many areas of the state there was a call by the teams and the ultimate goals for a decrease in populations, because we are at such high population levels, and there was causing issues for agriculture and forests and ecological concerns. And so there was a wide interest in reducing those populations at that time, and in some cases might have kind of had a goal that led to too large a population decrease in some people's minds. And so we took those population goals that were set in the mid 2000s and started applying them to manage our populations towards the goal levels that were established. And we do that through annual season setting efforts. So we come up with new deer season regulations and bag limits each year. So the next slide kind of is a schematic that kind of shows you the kind of annual process that we go through. So it starts in the spring. We have a population model that estimates a deer per square mile, kind of at the pre-fawn point in time. So after all the winter mortality has taken place and before fawns are dropped in the spring. And so we have those deer density estimates for many permit areas across the state where we have enough information to develop a reliable population estimate. So you can see the darker red areas are the areas of higher deer densities in central Minnesota and southeastern Minnesota. And so we do this on an annual basis, and then we compare those to the goal that was last set for that deer permit area, and determine where we are relative to that goal. So I'll just kind of draw your attention to permit area 105, which is just the red area in the middle there, just south of the northwest angle. And so according to the legend there in the middle, that's much above the established population goal, so greater than 50% above goal. And so that 13 deer per square mile is at least 50% over the population goal that was prescribed for that unit back in the mid 2000s. So then based on that estimate relative to goal, we say, hey, we want to reduce that population and we want to have a fairly aggressive strategy to reduce that population. And so we have a number of different deer permit area designations that we use, from bucks only, where people can just shoot legal antlered males, only one deer limit, to an intensive designation where those green areas where they can have a 3 deer limit, so they could actually take 3 adult females, which would have a much larger impact on the population if a hunter did choose to do that. So a more liberal regulation. So for 2018, the regulation that was picked to move that population in permit area 105 back towards the goal level was an intensive designation, or a 3 deer bag limit. So any licensed deer hunter in the state with the appropriate licenses and tags can harvest 3 deer and register those in permit area 105. And the expectation is that will help us move back towards the goal that was established in the mid 2000s for that particular permit area. So that's the general process that we use from spring through the summer into the fall to set the annual hunting seasons to meet our population goals by deer permit area. So for each one of the 130 permit areas we have across the state. So that's kind of the background on how we have done deer population management in the past, and how we'll continue to do it. But as I mentioned, in the mid 2000s, a lot of the population goals that were developed had called for population decreases of around order of 25% decrease. And so we're successful using liberal regulations, intensive designations or extra early antlerless seasons to move those populations back down towards more reasonable levels. And then in 2012 and 2013 and 2014, we had some severe back-to-back winters, and we all know that in northern Minnesota, winters can have a significant impact on the deer population. So it led to quite a bit of deer mortality, and you can see our winter severity index map, which basically is a measure of snow depth and cold temperatures below zero, and kind of the darker the color there, the purples, the higher or the larger effect it would have on the deer population and more mortality. So they were, especially 2013 and 14 was a historically severe winter that had a large impact on the deer population in northern Minnesota. And this was after we had a real aggressive hunting seasons to reduce the deer populations in those areas. So because of those liberal regulations and severe back-to-back winters, we had depressed deer populations in northern Minnesota, and I started hearing from hunters about they were upset. There was not many deer left on the landscape. They weren't trusting how DNR was managing the deer population in a number of areas. The harvest had dropped. The statewide harvest had dropped from a peak in 2003 of nearly 300,000 deer statewide to about 150,000 deer statewide by 2014. Had some groups that were formed, like the Minnesota Deer Density Initiative. I know they took out ads in the outdoor news around this time saying, the DNR is managing for fewer adult deer than we have hunters or in these deer permit areas. So they were questioning the state's management of deer, and thought that we were kind of driving deer into extinction in some regard. So it got a lot of kind of political pressure about how we were managing deer. And I know further to the east in Wisconsin, just a few years prior to that, their Wisconsin DNR had got a lot of pressure about how they're managing deer, and they had an audit there, and some changes were made in Wisconsin. And so I think our Minnesota hunters and organized deer groups saw that, Wisconsin DNR was kind of changing their ways, and were pressuring us to take a look at our deer management program and see if we can change things and come up with a management system that was more in line with what hunters wanted. So there was a deer management audit that occurred in 2016. So the Office of our Legislative Auditor did this audit of our deer management program. And it was a pretty comprehensive review of how we manage deer in the state, kind of focused on our population management. And it's just kind of an excerpt out of the letter that went along with the final report, which was from May of 2016. It said found that aspects of the department's management of deer populations in recent years were commendable and reflected local stakeholder interests. And we make a number of recommendations. And then the last one was that we should develop a statewide deer plan. And the DNR's response to that recommendation in the evaluation was that the evaluation identified a number of the complexities and challenges of managing Minnesota's deer population, and we at that time had already committed through pressure that we received from organized groups to develop a statewide deer plan. And so the DNR goes on to say that we're currently working on developing a process to complete a comprehensive deer management plan, and we will work to involve hunters and other stakeholders and include a broad array of public opinion to inform the plan as outlined by the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So that's kind of the history and kind of background of how we got to the start of a development of a statewide deer plan. And we've never had a statewide deer plan before. Always have managed deer populations at kind of smaller spatial scales throughout the state. So the idea here is that we wanted to have a kind of a strategic plan across the state to direct our efforts. So just kind of the process that we used, it was about a 2-year process to develop and draft and finalize this plan. So started off with information gathering by talking to agency staff, including DNR staff from other divisions, stakeholder groups, like Farm Bureau and forest management groups. And we did that in the summer of 2016 to kind of see where we were and what people were thinking about deer management and some of the things that they thought we should address with a statewide deer management plan. We held public meetings across the state, kind of in kind of at the regional geographic area. So we had several meetings in northwestern Minnesota, for example. And then we also had an input period to allow our stakeholders and hunters and citizens to identify the key issues that they thought we should address in our deer management plan. And then the commissioner authorized the formation of our Deer Management Plan Advisory Committee, or DIMPAC, we called it, and they met monthly over a course of about a year, and they were charged with providing recommendations to DNR for us to write the statewide deer plan. And it included originally 20 members, and 19 were able to kind of stick through, including some at-large members and also members representing groups, including deer hunting groups, farm groups, and then also folks that are associated with management in Minnesota's kind of forested landscape. So Minnesota Forest Partnership Resources Partnership had a member on the group. Minnesota Association of County Land Commissioners, 1854 Treaty Authority, and the Nature Conservancy all had members that participated in our DIMPAC citizen advisory group. And then this past spring, we had developed a draft plan and went out for kind of final public comment on that plan through a series of open houses held around the state, and then we had input online, and I think we got probably 1,100 or so comments from citizens across the state about our deer plan. Summarized those comments and incorporated into the final plan, which was finalized this past summer in 2018. Let me get the slide to advance here. So that one of the main tenets of developing our plan is noting that we manage deer, being the DNR, which is a trust manager, as a public trust resource. And in doing so, we have to account for the values and needs of all Minnesotans, both present and future. And then we're responsible and accountable for our decision making related to that as well. So this overall direction for this plan is based on our, DNR mission statements, both for wildlife and also the department as a whole, and also state statutes. So I think some people think that DNR wildlife just manages deer populations for deer hunters, and that's not the case. We have to account and manage for all Minnesotans. And so the plan is basically laying out our strategic direction for the next 10 years, which helps us identify or prioritize our resources and activities. And we do have a mid-plan review scheduled about 5 years into the plan as well to see if we need to make some course adjustments as we implement the plan. And kind of the outline of the plan is we have our goal topic areas or primary goals with objectives kind of relating to each one of those 8 goal areas. And then we have near-term strategies identified in the back, which are kind of our early implementation efforts here for the next 2 or 3 years. And then also we have performance measures or targets for each one of the primary goal areas to make sure that we're meeting our goals as we go along. We don't want this to be a plan that just sits on the shelf. We want to track our progress towards the goals that are identified in the plan. And also the document does a pretty good job of describing, what DNR has done in our deer management program, in the past, what we currently do, and how we plan to change in the future too. So it's a good reference document for folks that aren't real familiar with all the things that DNR does relative to deer and deer management in the state. So I'll just kind of touch on some of the primary goals that I think you'll be most interested in. So the first one is communication, information sharing, and public involvement. So one of the things we want to get more information out there. We want to be transparent with the public and our deer hunters. So we've enhanced our web pages and have a lot more information available on our deer management web pages and deer hunting web pages at mndnr.gov. So basically identifying the management direction and rationale for each deer permit area across the state. So kind of why we choose a 2 deer bag limit versus a bucks only for the particular year. And it's all about managing towards a goal population that was identified in those public processes in the past. Also, a goal is to get more population information out to the general public about deer densities by deer permit area. We have some of that information out there now, but the plan is to publish more of that information, and that's information that we consider in the spring when we're assessing deer populations and where we are relative to goal. And then also doing a fair amount more of disease outreach, especially related to chronic wasting disease or CWD, which is a real threat to our wild deer herd here in Minnesota. So doing a lot of work with outreach and sharing information with the public and also our deer hunters about disease threats here in Minnesota. Also, the plan identifies additional input opportunities that will be available to the public and deer hunters as going forward. We have biannual area deer meetings that will be scheduled, and they're designed to be kind of informal opportunities for anybody with an interest in deer to talk to their local area wildlife manager about deer populations and deer management in the area. And also we'll be forming a statewide deer input group to address issues identified in the plan and issues that arise as the plan is implemented, just to provide some additional recommendations and input and guidance to DNR as we implement this plan. So you can see in the middle here is an example of some information we have available right now on our DNR website through our interactive deer permit area map. And so it's a very nice kind of one-page synopsis of what's going on in a particular deer permit area. This is permit area 172, which is in kind of north central Minnesota, includes the Chippewa National Forest in the northeastern part. So it gives a wildlife manager report for this particular year, their contact information, information about harvest, lands open to hunting, what the and hunter densities, management designations, that type of thing. So a lot of good information on that kind of one-page PDF document that's available on our DNR webpage through our interactive deer map. And also we've tried to do a better job putting additional information and justification on our website related to our deer population goals. So here we have on the right hand side our deer population goal report from the East Central Block that we last set goals in 2015, describing kind of the process, what was recommended, and how we arrived at the final population goal. So that those reports are available on our DNR deer management page as well. So I've been doing putting more information on our DNR website in the past couple of years, and we plan to do more of that moving forward. The other big thing to mention in this particular goal area is our population goal setting effort. So it was started in the mid 2000s, continued through 2015. It varied a little bit through time, trying to improve the process as we went. And just so folks know, we do plan to continue with our population goal setting effort by deer permit area across the state. And in the plan, we plan to do that in the first 5 years of the deer plan, and we'll be revisiting all the deer permit areas statewide in that period of the plan. And it'll be a 16-month process that we'll be using per block of deer permit areas. So we'll be surveying landowners and hunters initially in a randomized fashion to get good kind of baseline information about what's going on and what people are thinking about these particular deer permit areas. And then moving through informing the stakeholder teams, and then getting public input, and then finally providing a recommendation for the commissioner to approve. So some changes that people should note if you're familiar with the past processes. This time around, the intent is that we'll have a longer term goal, be a 10-year goal. In the past, we had indicated it'd be like a 3 to 5 year goal. Didn't have really the capacity or resources to get back to those goals on that kind of shorter time frame. So I think we're being upfront now and saying that these are going to be longer term goals, so about 10 years in duration now. And also in the past, we had a limit on the percent change that the teams could recommend. In 2015, we said they couldn't be any more than 50% increase from what the current level was, or 50% decrease. So kind of putting sideboards on those population change goals. And now we've removed that limit because there's a real controversial move. A lot of deer hunters or folks that thought the deer populations had really collapsed in northern Minnesota were calling for much larger increases by deer permit area, 100% increases or even more in some cases. So those sideboards have kind of been removed, which is kind of a watch out situation, and folks should be involved and kind of monitor that as we go. I'll just point out the permit areas that we did goal setting in 2015 are depicted on the map to the right there, and the dark green areas are the ones where population increases were 50%, which is a pretty significant change from where we were, and it might have been a reaction a bit to where the populations were. They were depressed from those two back-to-back hard winters, and so I think people were looking to drastically increase deer populations. And just to point out, in some cases, DNR thought those recommended goals by the team or by the public were too high. Like for permit area 259, you can see that there's a increase of 25%. That was the final goal, but initially the team was recommending a 50% increase there, and the public supported that. But running the numbers, DNR thought that was too high of deer density, especially for a forested permit area, and would have negative kind of ecological effects or effects on forest regeneration, and so dropped that goal to 25%. So DNR has kind of final say on what the goals will be, but it is largely determined by the teams and by public input. mentioned that another primary goal is on population management, monitoring, and research, and so it has several aspects. And this is all related to deer population. So we still fully intend to meet population goals that are identified for each individual deer permit area. But you may have heard that we have a secondary check or kind of performance measure or target on our statewide harvest level on an annual basis, and that number was set at 200,000 deer each year. And the idea there is um, that we understand that there's quite a bit of fluctuation in deer populations from year to year, but we want a kind of a 3-year running average or something to be average right around 200,000. And that was a pretty controversial number and something that's got quite a few headlines. DNR had initially recommended a smaller number, and numbers up to 225,000 down to 170,000 were considered by the DIMPAC advisory group. And that graph on the right there, you can see how population or how harvests have fluctuated over time, going back to about 1920 to last year's harvest, 2017, which was right about 200,000 or just below, which is that red line there. So you can see, in the mid 2000s and in the early 90s, we had statewide harvests that were over 200,000. But it is an aggressive target, but something that we think we can meet as long as our deer permit areas are at or near population goal statewide. So that's a goal we'll be trying to meet on an annual basis or over the course of 3 years or so. And then another thing that we mentioned in this goal area is that moose are the priority in their primary range. So up in the northeastern Arrowhead region of the state, we a couple years ago realigned our deer permit areas there to match the moose range, and so we're managing deer populations differently there, and because we all know that high deer densities have a negative effect on moose survival due to brainworm or P. tenuis. And so we're managing deer differently in that part of the state and trying to favor moose, and also doing some different habitat management in the primary moose range, larger patches, larger harvests or disturbances with larger reserves, focusing on summer and winter thermal cover for moose because they tend to get overheated both in the summer and the winter, and then having areas, aquatic foraging areas for them as well. So trying to kind of tip the balance in moose's favor in that part of the state where we've had population concerns and issues. And then also we'll be continuing to refine and improve our deer population modeling work that we do on the individual areas across the state. So continue to improve our parameters that go into that model and how things are adjusted from a year-to-year basis. And just kind of as an overview to our population model, so the two primary drivers in annual deer populations are what our hunter harvest is or each fall. So we have mandatory reporting of hunter harvested deer, so we know kind of age and sex and numbers of each deer that was taken by deer permit area in the state, which is a great source of information for us. So that information is plugged into our model. So you can see their population level in mid-September prior to the hunting season, have a number of those deer that have green tags on them. They were harvested, so we know where those deer were taken and what kind of deer they were. And we also account for some wounding loss and also poaching loss. And then we come up with a early winter estimate after the hunting season has concluded at the end of December. The next major mortality factor that we account for in our population model is winter severity. So anytime a day in the winter has 15 inches of snow or more, get a point. And any day that the minimum temperature is below 0 Fahrenheit, we also get a point. So more severe winter as measured by deep snow and cold days have a larger effect on whitetail deer, and especially and affect different cohorts differently. Like fawns are more susceptible to winter mortality than adult does or bucks. And so we have an estimate which varies by winter severity on mortality, which is also factored into our model for each deer population within the deer permit areas across the state. And so those are the primary factors, and this effect from winter severity can carry forward into the spring and summer as well. Fawns are lower birth weights when they are born after a severe winter because their mothers are in poorer condition. The lactation from the females is not as good, so the fawns do not get the nourishment they need in the spring, so they generally do not grow as fast and are probably more susceptible to predation in the summer as well. So the effects of severe winter can carry forward into the spring and summer as well. Another primary goal is healthy habitat. You want to increase the quality and the amount of habitat where needed in forested regions. We have a lot of habitat here in northern Minnesota and the forested regions of the state, but we always are looking to increase the quality of that habitat, and then also especially concerned about winter cover. Make sure we have adequate winter cover in the form of white cedar for deer yarding areas or jack pine, depending on what the local deer winter cover is with associated browse in the nearby vicinity, so those deer herds can make it through severe winters. Also, another objective is to increase access for private land for population management. It's important to harvest deer across all ownerships in the forest and try to maintain deer numbers at reasonable levels and have fairly even deer densities, because when we have pockets of high deer densities or low deer densities, it causes management issues. So it's important to have access to private land for hunters and allow them to harvest deer. And also want to continue to provide assistance to private landowners to improve their properties for wildlife habitat, especially in the forest. We have the forest stewardship planning process and a lot of good partners that help us with that work. I want to continue to be involved in forest planning efforts and determining the right kind of harvest levels and for future forest composition that benefit wildlife, and then also deal with adjacent ownerships differently to kind of coordinate those responses and that management to benefit wildlife habitat and white-tailed deer. And also talk about the impacts of deer on other resources. It's another primary goal that we have. Technical assistance on how to deal with overabundant deer in local areas, or how to do damage abatement and prevent damage from occurring either through bud capping or protecting stored forage. We hear a lot from agricultural producers about deer damage, and also folks that manage the forest that are challenged by higher deer numbers or deer that kind of target particular tree species. And we also say in the plan we want to provide additional harvest opportunities for a variety of folks so they're able to manage local populations to reduce negative impacts. And then also we want to consider impacts to other resources in our decision-making process. Most notably our population goal setting work to make sure that we have stakeholders there that represent other interests besides deer hunters or folks that want to see higher deer numbers. So we want to make sure that we consider their thoughts in making those decisions. So I guess at this point I've probably talked for a while here and just kind of open it up to any questions, Matt, that have come in, or address any comments.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Again, for folks that are watching online, feel free to type questions into the chat area, and we can relay those to Eric. Well, we've had two come in, Eric, I think related to what you just talked about, and that's kind of protecting seedlings and protecting trees from the impacts of browse. So one comment, trying bud caps, plant skid, and fencing, but that only goes so far. Any suggestions to help my pines so that they don't become bushes? And maybe kind of more broadly, where you point landowners to and other resource managers with resources for protecting trees?
Yeah, so I think one of the primary things that we talk to agricultural producers about, and also forest managers, is making sure that we have adequate harvest occurring on those lands within the state regulations. Trying to focus on antlerless harvest, especially adult does, because those are ones that kind of drive population growth. So as allowed by existing regulations and bag limits to focus hunters in on adult does, encourage them to take adult does, get additional hunters on your property to take those deer, because the bag limits are kind of per hunter in the state. So the more hunters you have, the more deer that they can take. So that's harvest management is really key. And then as far as I would talk with area wildlife managers for your local area about other protection options, or kind of design of, and also local foresters as well, to find out what tools and techniques that work best for them. So kind of connect with your local wildlife manager for some more specific instructions.
Great, thanks. Not seeing any more questions, so yeah, feel free to take it away again, Derek.
Okay, sounds good. I'll continue on here. Just kind of touching on some other topics that will probably be of interest to folks on the webinar. Just a note about deer feeding. That was something that the DIMPACT group, or the Citizen Advisory Group, was really interested in banning statewide, primarily for disease concerns, especially CWD. They did not want this to contribute to the spread of CWD across the state. So just kind of bring people up to speed on where we're at with deer feeding in Minnesota. Baiting or feeding is illegal for hunting in Minnesota, for deer hunting, yeah, which is different from other states. So I guess we're in a better position to start with. As far as baiting, we don't have a tradition of baiting here in the state, and I know there is some illegal baiting that takes place, but our enforcement folks work to make that unappealing for people to try with through tickets and fines and that type of thing. So baiting is illegal, so hunters cannot use it to bring deer close to their stand. So that is a good starting point. And also we have bans for deer feeding that are currently in place for CWD or disease reasons in fairly large areas of the state. You can see the counties that are affected in that middle graph for the 2018 deer hunting season. So southeastern Minnesota, kind of south central Minnesota, and central Minnesota. So these are temporary bans. Since we have a risk of CWD in these areas, we're saying recreational deer feeding is prohibited, but those bans can be lifted if the threat goes away. And there has been interest for quite some time in a prohibition of recreational deer feeding statewide. It causes a lot of issues, and we just haven't had the political momentum or groups that are willing to kind of push that issue. It's a well ingrained activity in a lot of rural areas in the state, and in northern Minnesota, people like to feed deer. Like to see deer outside of their window. It's a big business for a lot of people too. A lot of feed stores and sell deer corn and deer feed, and so it's a recreational activity. So it'll be challenging to deal with that issue going forward. But in the plan, we've said, rather than banning deer feeding statewide, through the implementation of this plan, we wanted to take kind of the temperature of the public some more and do some more educational work and engage that statewide deer input group in this topic to help us kind of move the issue forward and move towards maybe a statewide prohibition on deer feeding in the future, because it does cause a lot of other issues besides disease transmission concerns. Oftentimes you'll see increased predation around feeding sites. Deer behave differently. They become more habituated to people. They might lose their migratory behavior. Increases deer vehicle collisions. A lot of times, deer feeders might be drawing deer across the road and making them more vulnerable to collisions, and also causes, habitat or crop depredation in the vicinity too. Especially, folks are probably familiar with forests you might manage next to a lot of deer feeding activity. Those areas get a lot of additional browse pressure in the winter too, as deer move to and from these feeding sites. So some really good reasons to move towards a statewide feeding ban, but certainly need some more work in that regard. Another challenging subject is deer browse impacts. We certainly DNR Wildlife recognizes, and other DNR staff, that there's some significant issues around the state with deer damage to forest regeneration, especially planted seedlings, and also impacts to native vegetation and native plant communities. There's been a lot of work in Minnesota and in the Midwest and throughout the country on what impacts high deer numbers have on our forests and our natural systems. And we see some of that work with deer exclusion fences, especially here in the state and state parks and other reserves. You can see impact of browsing inside and outside the fence. There's been a lot of ecological studies. DNR Wildlife tried to do an alternative deer management study in state parks here a few years ago to see how understory browse impacts varied with deer density. It's a challenging thing to get at to see what those effects are and kind of what the thresholds are for deer density. And those interactions are complex. I kind of a graph here from a technical um, report from the Forest Service, kind of showing how things vary as far as the impact or on communities or effect on regeneration, depending on what the quality of the habitat is or how much deer food is available in the landscape. So kind of intuitively, if you have a 40-year-old spruce plantation that covers a square mile, and you have 20 deer in that spruce plantation, there's probably not a lot of understory there or a lot of food. So any remaining plants there would have a really high impact, and additional regeneration would get heavily impacted by deer. And compare that to a very diverse forested landscape that's got very good habitat and understory development, maybe some food plots in it on that same square mile of land, and we probably see much lower impacts to the vegetation from those same 20 deer on that landscape there. So it really varies depending on the quality of the habitat or how much deer food is available in the area. So just a kind of a useful figure to kind of show that there's some differences across the state depending on what the habitat is like and what the predicted impact to regeneration or native plant communities might be. And there's been some efforts to kind of monitor that. And folks have looked at the FAA data set and to see what the impacts are, but it's not really designed to document those browse impacts and really isn't at an appropriate scale to adjust our management, deer management efforts here in the state of Minnesota. So we're looking to develop a new monitoring system here in the state, working with other DNR divisions, the Nature Conservancy, U of M, and maybe others to develop a monitoring approach to see what kind of impacts deer are having on the landscape and how we should adjust our management to minimize those impacts. So a challenging topic that we've been wrestling with for a number of years, especially in the forested part of the state. Another thing that might not be intuitive to many, but deer hunter numbers. We currently have about 500,000 deer hunters in Minnesota, have a great tradition of deer hunting here in the state. But these deer hunters, many of them are baby boomers and are aging out of, the hunting population. And we don't have adequate replacement from younger generations. So we're kind of losing our hunter base from 2000 to 2015, the percentage of Minnesota's purchasing a deer license declined by about 15%. So we don't have the deer hunter participation that we once did, and we're losing hunter numbers over time. We're trying to combat that trend through our R3 efforts, recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters, but have a lot of other demands especially for kids' time and attention. And there's some barriers involved in getting deer hunters started, and again continuing on with the sport. And just to point out, I know many people are familiar with this, but deer hunters are the ultimate deer managers in the state, and they are needed to manage our populations. You can see our hunter harvest has fluctuated from 300,000 to 150,000 in the last couple of decades, and just kind of imagine if that number of deer weren't removed from the landscape annually, what kind of population growth we would have without hunters providing that service and removing those deer, because we do not have the natural predators and we have likely better habitat than we did in the past. And so, deer numbers, if left unchecked, will grow in a quick fashion. And you can talk to urban deer managers that don't really have the option of recreational deer harvest or sport hunting, and it can be very expensive to remove deer from an area either through sharpshooters or using contracts. So hunters are willing to pay to remove deer, and it is a good idea to maintain our hunter numbers and our ability to manage populations going forward. So something that we should all be interested in. Just a note about some early implementation efforts. So these are some of the strategies that we've implemented here since it was finalized this summer. We've started holding our biannual area deer meetings so folks can meet with their local DNR wildlife managers. So we hosted about 35 of those meetings across the state in late August and early September. We'll have another set of meetings here in late spring. So look for announcements about that. And so that's we had about 220 people or so, or about 6 people attend each one of those meetings from the public, up to about 20 individuals. So looking to increase participation there and get more attendees and more people talking about deer and meeting their local wildlife manager. We're currently planning for the next round of goal setting, which will start probably with surveys here in January, and we're kind of looking at the areas that have the oldest goals right now, which is in north central in far northern Minnesota, kind of from the International Falls to Baudette areas, northwestern Minnesota, and kind of through the southern transition, the kind of that pink or salmon colored group of permit areas centered around 200 series, and so down to the southern Iowa border. And so we'll be probably looking at those permit areas first since they're the oldest goals, and then probably the last permit areas we'll get to were the ones that were just set in 2015 on that previous map that I had showed you, or previous slides. And so we'll be looking to cover the entire state again. So look for those that schedule and become involved in that. We have new research projects that we've implemented, especially in southeastern Minnesota, to study the movement of white-tailed deer related to chronic wasting disease and how they might spread that disease through the landscape, how the young deer, both males and females, disperse and maybe come in contact with new deer in new areas in southeastern Minnesota. Also have another collared deer research project that started in northern Minnesota to look at how white-tailed deer use winter cover up there on a more fine scale, and also to look at fawn survival in more severe winters. So initiated some new research projects to fill some information gaps that we have. And it'll be in the process of hiring additional big game program staff, folks like myself. I'll be done here in mid-November, but be looking to fill this position permanently, and then also have a human dimensions person. They'll be hired to do survey work and engage public support of different aspects of our deer management, and also we have hired a southeast deer population specialist to deal with some of the population issues and disease issues we have in far southeastern Minnesota. So how can you become involved? So just some opportunities I'll mention. First of all, get to know your local area DNR wildlife manager. Talk to them about deer management issues and challenges you're having, what you're seeing in the field. Just kind of develop a relationship with them and get to know them and kind of how we manage deer. If you have an opportunity to complete any deer-related surveys, you might receive them in the mail. Might asked to help with some kind of population survey or research project. So to help with those surveys to help us improve our knowledge of deer in your area would be helpful as well. We have a bow hunter observation log study that we're doing right now to help us kind of gauge how many deer are on the landscape based on bow hunter observations during the fall hunting season. So it might be an opportunity for some of you to participate in that. Attend these area deer meetings that are being scheduled. If we have public input meetings related to deer regulations or other management issues, encourage you to attend and speak up at those meetings or provide comments online. A real key one is to apply to participate in a deer goal setting team. As these permit areas come up for goal setting in the next 4 or 5 years, and that's where you can really have an impact. And we're always looking to hear and have folks apply that aren't necessarily just deer hunters. Folks that are interested in forest management. So always a challenge to get folks from the agricultural community and from the forest management community to participate in those teams, and it's real important to do that. You can become involved in the other topics I mentioned, like deer feeding or browse monitoring impacts, help us move those issues along. Also, through your day-to-day management or planning efforts, improve forest and wildlife habitat across the state, and also with talk about needing new hunters and our losing our hunter base. Certainly encourage new hunters however you can, and also encourage deer hunting on the lands you manage, not only for population management, but also to provide access for hunters to participate in the sport. And with that, as kind of mentioned, the last goal that we mentioned in our plan, kind of continuous improvement. So we understand that deer management is challenging and we're kind of pulled in a lot of different directions, but we'll continue to try to improve our management as time goes on, and just try to make it better for all of us. So with that, I encourage you to check out our full deer plan on our deer plan webpage, which you can see the link down below here, and I think we'll probably include the link to all the participants. And with that, I think I'll open up to additional questions if we have time. I got a few minutes, it looks like.
Yes, thanks, Eric. That was a great overview of the process at the DNR and how you've been working with others over the past several years. So thanks for sharing that.
Yep.
We have our first question is about deer vehicle collisions. You mentioned as something that you integrate into your estimates. So the question is, how significant are deer vehicle collisions on the overall deer herd numbers?
It's going to vary. Some states and used to, they still track deer vehicle collisions as a kind of index to population. So the more collisions you have, that would indicate you have a higher deer population. You can track those trends over time. It's something that's important to us. Certainly, we don't want to see damage to your vehicle, or especially personal injuries related from deer vehicle collisions. But it's something that we don't really have good data for right now. I think we address it in the plan, and kind of one of our call-out sections. Used to have pretty decent information statewide, but the reporting has changed. So it's something that we're trying to minimize statewide. But we don't really have good information related to that. I think there's been, probably insurance company surveys or that type of thing put out more information about deer vehicle collisions, but it varies quite a bit across the state depending on, whether you're in rural Minnesota, how much driving occurs on an annual basis, what the deer population is, what the road density is. So it's something that varies quite a bit depending on where you are in the state, but there certainly are hotbeds, and certainly the number of collisions increases with increasing deer numbers and more drivers on the road.
Great. Well, I guess I have one more question, and there may be time for additional ones if folks want to type them in. But another question is kind of what you're hearing from other state agencies and the challenges that they have with managing their deer. I mean, you mentioned things like chronic wasting disease and deer browse, but what are you hearing from other states, and what kinds of things are they dealing with?
Yeah, especially in the mid 2000s when we had historically high deer populations in the state. Other states were dealing with that, and now it seemed like it's been kind of the ebb to concerns about low deer populations because of liberal regulations. That other states or agencies allowed additional doe harvest, and it brought the deer populations down. Other states have been wrestling with disease issues as well. The primary one being chronic wasting disease, but there's also EHD outbreaks in more southern states or states out west that lead to short-term reductions in populations. In the mid 2000s, another big focus was urban deer management. There was overabundant deer populations and kind of suburban urban environments, and kind of developing tools to address those deer issues and reduce deer densities in those areas. And so we've continued to do that here in Minnesota through special hunts and especially trained bow hunters and more liberal regulations like in our metro permit area 601, where folks can shoot an unlimited number of antlerless deer in that area, trying to reduce the number of deer in that urban suburban landscape where they tend to cause more problems. Yeah, so just a variety of issues around the country right now. I think the main focus really is on CWD and the long-term threat that poses. And out east, there was also concerns on the East Coast with overabundant deer numbers, really kind of denuding their public forest lands from understory vegetation, and so I think they recognized that they were managing for way too many deer on the landscape in states like Pennsylvania, and have implemented strategies to keep those populations more in check with the available habitat and the carrying capacity of that habitat. And I think we haven't had quite as many issues here in the state of Minnesota, but certainly something that we're concerned about. We don't want an overabundant deer population kind of denuding our forests of their character and regenerating trees and the understory. So something that we're certainly cognizant of, and something that we don't want to occur here in the state. But some lot of different challenges around the country related to deer management.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. Not seeing any more questions come in. I do want to point folks to links that Madison Rodman just shared. If you're interested in continuing education credits, there's a link there to fill out. Also for feedback on the webinar, and there's a link there that Madison shared. So I encourage you to use those resources if you need them. Great. Well, we'll conclude, and thanks to Eric for providing this overview. We will have a recording of this as well, and I believe Madison Rodman will send that out probably within the next few days to folks that have registered. So thanks again to Eric, and wanted to point people to next month's webinar. That's on Tuesday, November 20th, and that webinar will be on forest inventory and LiDAR and what the Minnesota DNR is doing, kind of integrating remote sensing with forest inventory information. So encourage you to attend that webinar next month. And so with that, Eric, you got us right on time. We're ending at 1 o'clock. So thanks again, Eric. We'll sign off now, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.